Hello, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the Loksatta live series on yet another Sunday. After the very successful discussions last few weeks on judicial reforms and agricultural reforms, and last week about policy in primary education, this week we bring you another topic that seems to be of a lot of interest to many of you, and that is to do with the taxes and public finances. What exactly is happening with taxes, who is getting our taxes, how are they being distributed between the center and states and the local government, and more importantly, is the tax money being spent wisely? So today to talk about that, we have again Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, Loksatta founder and national president, and joining Dr. J this week is a guest speaker for us, Mr. Nitin Pai. Nitin is the founder and director at Takshashila Institution, a public policy institute running out of Bangalore, and and also editor of Pragati, the Indian National Interest Review. Nitin talks about strategic affairs. And his particular interest is in geopolitics. You can follow Nitin on a Twitter handle ACON, ACORN. So welcome you all, Dr. JP and Nitin and others joining on the Hangout. So let me start with the fundamental question here that we all have in mind, and maybe each of you can take 2 minutes each to share your opinion on that. Where exactly are the taxes going? What is the tax revenue that Government of India and the state governments are getting out of all of us, and how is it being used? Dr. JP?
Okay, Srinivas, I'll be brief, as I said. The first is, if you take the tax GDP ratio, ours is pretty low. I think a ballpark number, though we don't have exact statistics because the state's compilation is not that easy. I would say, if you take the 2014-15 budget numbers, the government's revenues, not merely taxes but other fees included, is about 11.89 lakh crores. But that probably comes to about $1.87 trillion of the GDP in India. It probably comes to about, let's say, how much, about 10% or so, roughly 10% or 11% at the federal level. States probably collect another 7% or thereabout. I could be wrong by a percentage point, but we're looking at 17 to 18% tax GDP in India. Local governments, except a few cities like Mumbai, there's hardly any significant contribution to the total overall taxation in the country. Our expenditure is about 7-8% more than this, because the federal or the union level fiscal deficit is about 4.1, 4.2, 4.5%. The states add another 2.5-3%. Therefore, you're looking at another 7% added expenditure. That means our total expenditure is probably of the order of 25, 26, 27% GDP. So as all developing democracies do, the tax GDP ratio is a little low relative to advanced countries. We all must understand this. But the second thing we have to examine is how is this money spent? All over the world, typically healthcare takes about 7 to 8% of the GDP from the public exchequer. In India, it is a grand total of 1%. It is a shockingly small number. All over the world, education takes about 5 to 6% of the GDP from the government. In India, it's about 3.2% at all levels put together. So again, a significant deficit. So what are we doing with the rest of the money? Well, it's anybody's guess. A lot of money is going only to pay the employees' salaries and a few other things. Certainly, defense takes away some money, though not a huge amount of money in GDP ratio. So the purposes for which the government is intended, I think they're not being served. We all know the problems. We're all in this because we are all worried about governance. The police, the law courts, the rule of law, the basic public infrastructure of roads and transport and power sector, or the basic amenities of water, sanitation, so on and so forth. And of course, education, healthcare. Every sector we are incredibly deficient. The third issue is the tiers of government. Across the world, if you take the United States, for instance, out of the about 41-42% public expenditure they incur, 37-38% public expenditure they incur, the states, the union government, the federal government spends about, I have the number here, it's about 21%. whereas the local governments spend about 10% of the GDP. The states spend about 9%. UK, there are only two tiers. There's no state tier, though there are regional parliaments. Therefore, increasingly now, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, they're becoming important. But in general, expenditure is largely at the union level and the local level. UK, again, the local expenditure is about 8 to 9%, whereas the federal expenditure or the union expenditure in the UK is about 32%. So total about 42, 43%. So in India, the union spends about, let's say, 21, 22% of that. A significant amount actually is transferred to the states. 7.8 lakh crores this year is the transfer to states, and that comes to roughly about 7-8% of the GDP transferred to states. Therefore, out of the total expenditure of the union, 7-8% again goes back as transfer resources. States spend the balance money. Local governments spend a very small amount of maybe 2% of the GDP. So we have a very skewed kind of thing in every which way. A, the purposes for which the money is spent. B, the tiers at which the money is spent. And of course, C, the tax to GDP ratio is low. We have to fix all these. Areas of reform are important. Therefore, in the course of discussion, probably we can go into that. Unless we understand why and how public money is spent, I don't think we can improve the quality of governance. Nitin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just want to make some initial comments. There are, various sort of imbalances and paradoxes in the way our public finances occur, and we can spend the whole night or a few days talking about these imbalances. But for today, I just want to bring out three relevant ones. The first one is to do with the way we have a tax base. In public finance, it is considered a good idea to collect a little bit of tax from a large number of people. So you have small, low tax rates, but you broad base the tax base so that you collect maybe 1 rupee from a billion people to make 1 billion rupees. What we have in India instead is a very opposite, lopsided thing, where we have a very narrow tax base and we charge them extremely high rates of tax. For example, many of us will be surprised to know that the number of people who are income tax assessees, personal income tax assessees in India is only about 40 million. So out of 1.2 billion people, or maybe out of 400 million adults, 500 million adults, we have only about 40 million people who are registered to pay income tax. And the tax rates, as you know, are from anywhere from 12 to 24 to 34%. So we have a very lopsided system where very few people are taxpayers. And now the fact that, of course, other people also pay indirect taxes from sales tax and other taxes, but direct taxpayers, people who see large amount of their income disappear in the form of tax every year, is only 40 million. And that has consequences for democracy, because a large number of people not being taxpayers of this kind, income taxpayers, have a very freewheeling approach to democracy. People sort of feel that, let the government pay for it, When people say let the government pay for it, they don't realize it's they who are paying for it, because only 40 million people are paying for it. So both in terms of fairness and in terms of stake in democracy, the way we have a tax base makes a huge difference to how our public finances are structured, as well as how our democracy shapes outcomes. The second lopsidedness is in terms of who's actually generating the tax revenues and what services they are requiring, what they are getting. So, for example, if you are a member of a club and you pay a large amount of membership fees of the club and you don't see anything coming back to you, don't see goods coming back to you, you have two responses. One is you will say, look, I'll quit this club and join some other club, which gives me better services. Or you will try and cheat on the membership dues that you have to pay, because knowing fully well that you're not getting your money's worth. Now, this is the kind of system we are in, where the taxpayers, the people who generate taxes, the people who do productive work in the economy as entrepreneurs, as even consumers, who buy products and therefore pay taxes, very little comes to them in terms of basic services of the tax from the state. As Dr. JP put it, healthcare, education, and other things which usually are basic services provided by the state, are assured to the taxpayer in some way in most developed economies, most developed democracies. In our case, it's not happening. So there is a lopsidedness. In other words, the tax collector is not sensitive to the needs, real and perceived, of the person who pays the tax, or the persons or the entities that pay the tax. The third, in this I must also point out, there is a huge urban apathy as well. For example, our cities generate huge amounts of our taxes, and the quality of our cities show that the adequate amount of revenues are not being spent on the cities, which shows in terms of bad infrastructure, bad public transport, bad public health, poor planning of our cities, rampant violation of laws, traffic. So the urban mess that many of our cities are in is a direct consequence of underinvestment, public underinvestment in our cities, which is again a consequences of this lopsidedness in the way tax revenues are handled. And the third lopsidedness or imbalance, I would say, is in terms of priorities. Dr. JP put it very nicely with numbers. I just want to put it in terms of, give you a qualitative feel, is that you would do, if you have 100 rupees, you would spend the 100 rupees on the most important things first. And then once you have done your most important things like paying your house rent and paying your life insurance and paying for your food and other things, then you will start paying spending money on cinema and discretionary things. But what seems to be in the case in the Indian public finance setup is that all sorts of expenditures are paid off first, and then when you realize you have no money, then you say, oh, I need to impose a cess for education, an education cess or a higher education cess, which feels very, which the government feels very good asking, and people willingly pay because government, education is a good cause. So when you say an education cess, you don't feel that bad paying that. But in reality, the question is, what did you do with the first all the tax revenues in the first place? Why did you have to charge a cess for education? I would have thought that education is the first thing you would pay. So we have many of these imbalances, paradoxes, which are inherent in sort of our public finance, which we have to address on a priority. Otherwise, I think we will find ourselves talking about fiscal deficits and subsidies really in a vacuum and without having a firm basis of how to move forward.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Nitin. Dr. JP, I have a question for you. If you could tilt your screen, you're out of focus. Nitin talked about both direct and indirect taxes. If I look at, as an individual, the sum total of taxes that I pay, like he said, it's the minority of us that pay an income tax. But all of us pay, or most all of us pay, other forms of taxes, right? It might be property tax, road tax, it might be sales tax, VAT, surcharge, whatever, and various cesses. But the point is, if I pay anything at all to an individual or a private entity. So for example, if I'm going to buy a piece of property and I buy the seller a certain amount of money, or if I'm going to buy a toothpaste, a bar of toothpaste, and I buy it and I pay the retail store a certain amount of money, I get two things. First, I get a statement of some sort. This might be a bill, this might be a property statement that says this is the size of the property worth this much, and I also get a breakdown. The airline ticket, for example, will tell me how much I'm paying because of airport fees, how much I'm paying because of surcharge, da-da-da. So I am entitled as someone who pays the money to get from the receiver a statement that says how much I've paid and what is the breakdown. Now, if I'm paying it to the seller for a certain kind of use, the seller also, if I'm paying it to the receiver for a certain kind of use, the receiver also owes me a second thing. How was it put to use at the end? If I give my daughter 100 rupees and I ask her to go to the shop, I expect her to account for the money I gave her. Now, why can't I expect a statement at the end of every year from the government as a citizen that tells me this is the total amount of money I collected from the citizens of India under each head, under income tax, under property tax, under sales tax, under VAT, under surcharge, under road tax, da-da-da. And this is the amount that was sent to the states. This is the amount that was spent on education as a percentage, as a pie chart, as actual numbers. They owe it to me. Why can't I get it? Can Loksatta arrange for this to happen?
Tara, that's exactly what the budget statements are about. the annual account statements presented in both Parliament and state legislatures do exactly this, except that it's done in such a complicated, obscure manner. It requires Nitin or somebody else to explain to us. To pour through these thousands of pages and make sense of it is one hell of a task. Even for me to make this brief presentation, I had to pour through hundreds of pages in India. Elsewhere in the world, they're available in a very transparent way in just one sheet or two sheets. So it's the transparency. Otherwise, on paper, technically, this is exactly what the budgets are supposed to be doing. The second thing is, as Nitin said, the money is not spent the way it's intended to be used. B, when it is spent, we're not getting the kind of results that we should be getting. So we have to fix both the problems. Unless there is public pressure as to where the money should go, and B, unless there is public pressure as to how to improve the quality, and unless we all design, those who are in the business of reforming the country's governance, design institutional mechanisms to make this delivery happen the way it's intended to, we always will continue to talk in circles. And that is really the challenge. Otherwise, the question we ask, the answer is available, but right now it's so obscure that it's only available to the cognoscenti. It's not yet transparent, but to be fair, it's getting better. In the past 20 years, we have a much better understanding of the budgetary processes and public finances in India than we had earlier. At least now there's greater transparency and greater clarity in numbers. But we have to do a lot more work to get better. Nitin?
Thank you, Dr. JP. I think, yeah, I agree with that. I think we've seen greater amount of transparency and greater amount of awareness among our people in terms of how to analyze budgets. I was just trying to dig out one graphic before I jumped in, but I couldn't dig out. There was Mint, the Mint newspaper had published a beautiful chart. It was a full center spread of how where the money comes from and where it goes. So, of course, it was again an abstraction for the union government's budget. But I think it was fairly well done in terms of where the union government gets its money from and where the union government spends its money. Now, what is interesting is there are various levels of government where all this happens. For example, the city corporations also publish their budgets. Because we teach the Bangalore Civic Leadership Incubator program, we took the opportunity to go and dig out this document. Now, interestingly, the document was not on the municipality's website. Although it was presented in the municipality, it is required to be put on the website. It was not on the website. It was in some other place, which we had to do some detective work to find out. And then when we found the detective work, much of the information is there. In fact, they had a nice pie chart which shows where does the money come from and where does the money go, where does the tax rupee come, where does the tax rupee go. But then, people had to do detective work to find this out. Similarly, you will have this for the state government also. Now, this comes back to the point I was making a little earlier. Now, because only about 40 million adults in the country pay tax, 40 million is probably pay income tax. 40 million is probably the largest set of people you will find in the country who are theoretically interested in finding out this information, as you expected, as you asked for. Where does my money come from? Where does it go? Get a detailed statement. 40 million is all there are. And 40 million is a very small number, and these people are distributed across 30 states. So in terms of sheer electoral pressure, they are not even voters which constitute, probably can swing one election in any one city. So, it's directly linked to this political problem. Because if you had, let's say, for example, 40 million, you had 200 million people who are income tax payers, you would have had a much larger, 5 times as many people who would have been asking the same question as you and I are asking today, you and I are discussing today. And maybe we would have influenced a lot more electoral constituencies and put pressure on the political leaders of all political parties to make this information available to themselves first and then to the constituent. In fact, we might even want to ask a question today: how many of the MPs in Parliament are really bothered about finding out this information which you asked? And the MPs are not interested because the constituents are not interested. So it's not that you can't expect have an unreasonable expectation from a legislator. The legislator more or less represents the interests and the demands of the people he or she represents. And today we don't have that demand. So on the positive side, I think the fact that we're moving towards greater urbanization, the fact that in the last 5 years we've had a tremendous amount of political awareness arising from several movements, of which Loksatta is also a part and a pioneer. Many of these movements are triggering off a greater amount of interest. For example, in the courses that we teach, we have a lot of people who come in wanting to genuinely find out this information, analyze budgets, and share it with their friends, colleagues, and other people. So the trend is changing, but as with everything in India, I think the trends will take some time before they become meaningful enough to have a political effect.
Thanks, Nitin. I have a follow-up on that. From what I heard from both of you, there is this whole thing about, we often read that a particular state, let's say Andhra Pradesh now recently because of bifurcation, or Karnataka or anybody, they seem to be saying, oh, we need more money from the center. And you hear it from Bihar, and whether who is in the coalition government seems to make a lot of difference. So what it translates to me, all of this tells me, is that there's a lot of discretionary distribution of revenue from the center to states. How much of the 7.8 lakh crores that Dr. JP just referred to in the opening actually is discretionary versus planned, and what is the actual mechanism where they're supposed to distribute the money among states, large, small, based on the needs and the, whatever is happening and all of that. What is the institutional mechanism so that common man and all of us can understand how that is supposed to be done, and your comments on how that is working out. Dr. JP, you can go first.
Okay, Srinivas, just to give you a rough idea, Government of India's current year's revenue is estimated at about 11.89 lakh crores. Don't worry about remembering the exact numbers, but just gives a general picture. Let's say about 12 lakh crores. Of that, about 7.8 lakh crores is transferred to the states. It's a very significant number. If you take as a share of tax revenues, you can easily calculate it comes to over 70%, over 60%, about 65% almost. A very significant number, probably the highest in the world among large countries. It goes in three forms. The first is the constitutional devolution by the Finance Commission of India. That is appointed by the Constitution every 5 years, and this system is working superbly. India actually has remarkably mature federalism in terms of resource transfers, in terms of Finance Commission. It is non-discretionary. About 30 to 33% of the total revenues raised by Government of India are transferred to states. I'm not going into minor technicalities here, but I'm giving you the gross picture. And probably the number is going to increase with each Finance Commission. The current Finance Commission is called the 14th Finance Commission, headed by Venugopal Reddy, who was the former RBI governor. The second major method of transfer is the Planning Commission, which is wrong, basically. It's a non-statutory, non-constitutional body, and it's good that they are disbanded in the Planning Commission, but still the so-called planned transfer of resources continues. I'm giving you the gross picture. It's not that all the tax revenues are transferred. Some of the planned transfers actually are loans to state governments. And some of it is the capital receipts. That means the borrowings by Government of India. It doesn't go from the tax money. It is actually borrowing, because it's supposed to be to build the capital assets of the country. And therefore, the earning capacity increases, therefore the repayment capacity is there. But for us, the gross picture is sufficient for the time being. The third is grants in aid in a variety of centrally sponsored programs. You have this Employment Guarantee Act, you have this Right to Education Act, you have some National Health Mission, you have something else. In that, a significant amount is contributed by the Government of India. But in the recent budget, one good thing that happened, India didn't really advertise it adequately. I think they should really speak about it very openly. They have taken away all the plan allocations and put it together with the grants in aid, so that it is simply a transfer to the states. There's no separate showing of plan and grants in aid separately. That's why about 50% of all the money that's going to the states and the center is now shown as grants in aid. Once the Planning Commission actually is disbanded, I hope the whole thing will be grants in aid. Now, we must look at two things, Srinivas. One is, on the whole, in our federal system, this is fairly fair, objective, and non-discretionary. It does not mean there is no discrimination between states. It's a genuine discrimination needed. It's not negative discrimination, it's positive discrimination. Because increasingly, when you talk about centrally sponsored programs or entitlements, what's happening is you are establishing certain benchmarks. In a country like Germany, by constitution, the federal government is duty bound to ensure that certain quality of services is available in each canton, in each province, and so on and so forth. Whereas in India, such a thing does not exist. So what we are accomplishing as a country is that Bihar is backward in education. Let us guarantee that X amount of infrastructure is available on the basis of the population in Bihar. or healthcare for that matter, which is a good thing. In the long term, it's good for the country. Therefore, the poorer states are subsidized by the richer states in the process. Therefore, Maharashtra gets, on per capita basis, much less money than, let us say, Bihar. Or much more money goes actually to Jammu and Kashmir, or let us say Himachal Pradesh, Uttaranchal, northeastern states, etc. The Andhra Pradesh case is a special one. Because the state's division was effected without the consent of the state, some amount of evasion was required, and there were genuine fiscal problems because a major city is now gone out of Andhra Pradesh, though it's a majority area, and therefore, tide over the short-term revenue deficits, the Government of India had to evolve a mechanism. It's still not operationalized, but probably for a limited span, let's say 10 years, Government of India will cover the deficit. It's not a big thing in the larger context of India, therefore that should not really reflect us in the overall discussion. Just to go back to Nitin's point as a corollary, he mentioned rightly that the urban India is now more aware of the notion of being taxpayers, because a large number of households in urban India are property taxpayers, and therefore it's a direct tax, and it pinches, and they are now increasingly demanding what's happened to our tax merit. And that's where the reform impulse is coming from. Therefore, if we demand greater devolution to local governments, and we are articulating in Loksatta a bulk sum so that people understand very simply, let's say 1,000 rupees per capita. If you take the total public expenditure in India, which roughly comes to about 20,000 rupees per capita in the country, a little more than that actually. Now, 1,000 rupees is just 5%. It's not a big amount. And it's not additional amount. It's simply the money spent in other ways by the states. Instead, if we allow this money at least to be spent in the local tier directly, with as much community control as possible. Let's say in villages, the panchayat itself. In municipalities, maybe the ward or even a smaller area which can be clearly delineated and defined. Then the chances are that these chaps will demand, we want better garbage clearance, we want better street lighting, better roads, better water supply. And the demand side will work better. In India, the problem is everything is about supply side. The demand side is not working. People are simply not conscious that they're entitled to these services. And that's the reason why shoddy public education and shoddy healthcare we're all tolerating, because I'm sure all of us who are participating in this Google Hangout, we have given up on government in terms of education and healthcare. There's not one of us who depends on this, which is a disgrace. Nowhere in the world does this happen. Our tax money is going, we're not getting any benefit. We're giving up on government. And where we cannot provide alternative solutions, the non-governmental solutions, like in policing, like in justice, like getting some municipal certificate, like water supply in cities, something else, things are completely in pell-mell. It's a disgrace. Unless the citizens are somehow made to articulate the demand and push the system to improve, neither will the quality leadership emerge, nor will public expenditure actually deliver the goods, nor will the tax compliance will be greater, because after all, there's not one of us who is willing to pay taxes deliberately. We're paying taxes because we have to pay taxes. We don't feel good about it. We don't feel the money is well spent. And there's no point saying everywhere that I have a danda, I'll beat you if you don't pay taxes. People must be willingly paying taxes. That happens only in a civilized society where you get something in return for the taxes. Right now, there's a complete breakdown of this nexus between taxes and services. For all these reasons, I think we have to completely redefine the way the government functions and localize as much as possible without any starry-eyed notions of local government. I don't have any starry-eyed notions of Gandhian notion of local government. I know that these fellows are as corrupt and as crooked as anybody else, but they're more amenable to public pressure. They could be more accountable, and let there be accountability instruments like an ombudsman to really hang them if they perform badly. And of course, the larger picture of reorienting public expenditure towards rule of law and towards basic infrastructure and towards education, healthcare. First, make the money that is spent work better. There's no point pumping more money into education, healthcare, unless you actually improve the quality of outcomes and make them more accountable. So unless there's a big debate in Modi government in this respect, I think whatever we talk about improving governance or even enhancing economic growth, there'll be a limitation. Right now, that is the fear that I personally have. I don't doubt the intentions of the government at the national level, but I don't know if they really looked at it much deeper and they understand the structural changes required and the institutional changes required to change the incentive structure. And that's where we all must really put some pressure on the government. Srinivas.
Thanks. Nitin? Nitin, if I may interrupt you for a second there, maybe one thing that I am trying to understand myself, and I'm sure many of our viewers also know, there is a finance commission, and that helps the central government in figuring out how to distribute money to the states. Okay, we understand that, read about it, and there is a seems to be a body and all of that. What happens from the state to the local bodies? Can you throw some light on that as part of your response?
Yeah, thanks. That's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to make two quick points to add on to the. I think a very. I was quite happy to get the. I mean, I was able to learn something from Dr. JP's point just now. So I just want to add two things by way of decoration to his response, not to add on to what he has said. See, I think first of all we must celebrate institutions in India which have been successful, and without doubt, the Finance Commission as as a constitutional institution has been hugely successful in keeping the country together. Mr. Vijay Kelkar, when he spoke to a Takshashila audience a few months ago, told us that it's one of the reasons India has been together as a nation state since 1950 is because of the Finance Commission. Because despite our diversity, despite the differences in the developmental needs of various states, we've managed to hang together as a nation because of one big reason is the Finance Commission. It is under celebrated. So I think it's very important for us to understand how this institution works, accord it the kind of respect, and maybe use it as an antidote to the cynicism which many people have about our constitution and our system, to say that look, here is something which works. Now there was a Gargill formula which they used to have, and now there is a revised Gargill Mukherjee formula and the various formulas, but it is done in a very professional, very transparent, whether I would say even very lofty and very enlightened manner, such that each state feels that it's getting a fair deal from the revenues which are coming out of the union government. Now there are two caveats here. The first thing is each state is supposed to have its own state finance commission, organized along the lines of the National Finance Commission, where the state decides what it does with the revenue it gets, which it has, and how does it distribute the state's revenues to various parts of the state. Now, the way the state finance commissions work across our country has been very patchy. There are some which are moderately good. There are lots of others which function very poorly and as appendages to the state government, as a elected state government. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to state finance commissions, because this is where much of the game is, because the citizen directly engages with the local government, the municipality, the Gram Panchayat, Zilla Panchayat, and the state government, not so much with the union government. But at that level, there seems to be very little accountability or transparency in how the money is allocated. So do the states, the cities in the states, do they get as much money as they deserve to generate more revenues? It's a very important issue. If you don't feed the city enough, if you don't support the city enough, the city will not generate as much revenue as it potentially can. And that kind of decision making, that kind of thought process is missing. And I think as a nation, as a bunch of people who are interested in developing India and transforming India, we have to pay attention to state finance commissions. There are 30 states in the country. Every single state, people in every single state have to take a very active, pay a very active attention to what is happening to the State Finance Commission, whether it is functioning transparently, whether it's doing the job as good as it ought to. There is no excuse for it not to work, because if the Union Finance Commission is working brilliantly, why are the State Finance Commissions not working as much? Why is the devolution of funds or the transfer of funds from the state government to the municipalities and the Gram Panchayats not taking place as they ought to? So that is number one. The second concern I have is a little bit of what happened in the UPA government, where the union government was directly trying to transfer funds to cities under the JNNURM and some other schemes, where while it looked like a practical way to address the city's needs, because the cities were in a state of disrepair and there was an urgent need to infuse capital infrastructure in the cities. So the JNNURM and schemes like it were used to quickly support the cities. But in doing so, we ended up in a very strange situation where the city governments were directly taking the money from the union government, of course through a state government as a channel, but the reporting relationship in terms of the federal structure came to be in doubt. When the union government had the money, it was calling the shots. I mean, he who has the gold makes the rules. That's a very old saying. And this was a very troublesome thing from a federal point of view. No doubt the JNNURM money in most cities went into reasonably good infrastructure, although the accompanying urban reform did not take place. But I'm not questioning whether the JNNURM was successful or not. In some places it was, in some places it wasn't. On the balance, maybe it was a good thing to have it when we did, otherwise our cities would have been in a worse shape. But moving forward, I think we have to be very wary of systems where we try to do stopgap or jugaad kind of a devolution, and instead we should function on making the constitutional structure work as it was designed to.
Thanks, Nitin. Shripal is dying to ask something about paying taxes when he doesn't see the roads in front of his house being laid properly. Shripal?
Yeah. Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Yeah, my question is it justified to ask for something like a right to refuse to pay tax? For example, if the roads on my street are not of stated quality, can I say, I will refuse to pay road taxes? I mean, ask for a law, ask for an act, which will enable me to refuse to pay the road taxes or something like that.
Srinivas, shall I take this question?
Yeah, go ahead, sir. Go ahead. He wants to refuse to pay taxes.
Yeah. Sadly, Shripad, such an option legally is not available, not only in India, but anywhere in the world, actually. Of course, the whole American democracy is built on the slogan of no taxation without representation. But officially, we all have representation. Now, it works, it doesn't work, that's a different matter. We're all exercised over it because it doesn't really work well. But legally, taxation is not an option. It's mandatory. And there's a difference between a tax and a cess, as Nitin has pointed out. A cess is for a specific purpose. At least legally, we can go to a court and say, if the education cess is collected, how come the money is not utilized properly for education if it's not actually deployed for that, or market cess, for instance, or some other cess. But cess is different from tax, though all of it goes to the government kitty. But constitutionally and legally, you have to pay tax, period. Therefore, what you are saying will actually become a reality if we try and transfer as much as possible to the local government, where there is a greater link between the taxes and services. And we can, in a variety of ways, not only by declining to pay taxes, but much more important, by insisting on the tax money being utilized in an appropriate manner that makes an impact on our lives, we can make change happen because the decisions are at the local level. The more centralized the decision making is, even if you really apply pressure, there is very little chance of that actually working. That's the heart of the problem. Now, Nitin made an important point about accountability mechanisms when the money is transferred directly from the union to the local governments. It's very vital. Certainly, the state government's accountability and its sovereignty cannot be questioned. But given the current situation, while accountability should be maintained at all levels, I think there is no substitute to union directly transferring a part of the money. For instance, the finance commissioner is transferring, let us say, about 3.5 lakh crores. I think the 14th finance commissioner will make it even a bigger one once their award comes in the next few months. We'll know. If you say 1,000 rupees per capita as a ballpark number, you're looking at 1,25,000 crores. That roughly comes to only 12% or so of the total devolution from the union to the states, and it comes to probably about 1/4 or so of the total devolution from the finance commission to the states. And therefore, it becomes relatively easy. It's somewhat painless because the incremental increase will more or less take care of this amount. Therefore, there is no real pain. But while retaining the accountability structure to the state government, and by creating some kind of an ombudsman institution so that there's no local abuse of money, I think we can make this work. Because right now, I do not see the willingness or the capacity of the states to transfer resources to local governments and to make the system work. Unless the union actually takes charge, it will not happen. I share the concerns of Nitin about federalism being affected. But as we discussed, one great thing that happened in India is our federalism is really effective. India has seen a remarkable maturation of federalism in the past 20, 30 years. And we are the only major country in the world which could build newly, afresh, a great federal democracy, a functioning federal democracy in the post-Second World War era. Therefore, I no longer have serious concerns about the federal-state relationships. But the third tier of federalism is equally important. The municipalities and the local governments cannot be treated as merely subordinate agents to the state governments. They have to be treated with respect as the third tier of federalism. And when the third tier is affected very badly by the second tier's functioning, I think the first tier has an obligation now to restore some balance. And politically, that's the only feasible one. Because the MLA and the official, both of them are the biggest enemies of any kind of serious devolution to local governments because they feel threatened. And there is no way state governments can go against the wishes of MLAs. And therefore, we have to devise an intelligent and a fair and a transparent and an accountable mechanism without diluting the state government's role in at least monitoring and giving a direction. And that's where I think the Finance Commission must be persuaded to go forward. And that's where Delhi, the union government, must be persuaded to go forward. Srinivas?
Nitin, did you have any follow-up on that?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think the idea that we should not pay tax because we don't get our revenues is getting very popular, and I would say there is a certain amount of romanticism to this kind of protestation. But I think it's a very, very undemocratic idea at its heart. Not only is it undemocratic, in a way it's nihilistic, anarchic kind of things. I think we should not move to any kind of we should not entertain or encourage any kind of ideas which says civil disobedience. I will disobey the law, which I think is unfair, because theoretically there is no way to determine what is the satisfactory level of a certain thing in order for a person to pay tax. For example, if I could say, unless you educate all my children to a PhD level, I will not pay tax. This makes me unhappy. Or I could say that unless the roads have 10% speed breakers or 10% potholes, I'm okay. If 21%, I'm not okay. This is a very arbitrary thing. As a practical matter, it's very arbitrary and we should not entertain it. But in principle, I think it's extremely undemocratic and not a constructive idea towards improving the nation. It's more of a rabble-rousing populist scheme, some of which we've seen in the last few years in terms of entering our politics. And I think we should, I'm making this point to a Loksatta audience to firmly puncture this balloon of trying to be anarchist or nihilistic in our politics. I think it is more important that as a nation we are more responsible. We pay our due, we pay our taxes and demand what is due to us, rather than try and escape from the situation by saying we are not getting what we deserve. The second question I think I saw on the side was, is it possible to have zero income tax? Actually, as a theoretical matter, as something which policy wonks like me would be interested in, is to find out whether the cost of collecting the tax, the total economic cost to the nation, to society of collecting the tax is greater than the total economic benefit of collecting the tax. And I think the jury is out. It's a very complicated calculation to make. And it would be of interest mainly to policy wonks, not so much to as a practical matter, because as a practical matter, the government needs revenues. Without government revenues, you cannot have a functioning state. So as a practical matter, we should not so much worry about reducing tax to zero, but we can do a lot in terms of making taxes much more simpler, in terms of tax rates, in terms of compliance, in terms of tax breaks, who pays what. So, the current system, I think, benefits a lot of chartered accountants and the entire tax compliance machinery more than it benefits the citizen. And I'm sure there are vested interests out there to ensure that the tax code is as complex as it is. But as citizens, what we should certainly ask for is in terms of how do we make the tax code a lot more simpler, a lot more straightforward, a lot more compliance friendly, rather than the way it is. And also to demand our tax returns being paid back to us as quickly as possible, the entire TDS system to be streamlined such that I don't have to pay taxes to the government in advance, rather I should pay that in arrears. So there are various procedural issues which need to be sorted out, and these are very tangible policy agenda for this and future governments. Now, on the issue of municipal governments, there's one interesting angle which doesn't normally enter the conversation in any policy setting. That is in terms of what can our cities, what can our villages do to raise more revenues on their own. So property tax is certainly one of them, but property tax is notoriously hard to collect in a fair way. So other than property tax, there are various ways you can generate revenue. One way to generate revenue, for example, is to charge for various assets which the state has, which are available in the city. Parking, for example. You know, it's so easy to, if you do the economic reasoning, it is so easy that allowing free parking on our streets is a net transfer of national wealth to people who don't deserve it. Because when you park a car, usually a person who has a car is on the upper part of the income bracket, and that person gets to enjoy public real estate entirely free of cost for that duration where the car is parked, right? So you multiply that by the number of cars on our streets. Actually, the municipal governments are losing a lot of revenue and giving away national wealth to people who own cars or other kind of automobiles, right? So there is a need to rationalize what is the assets which the municipalities and the gram panchayats have. Find out what are the assets which can be used and allocated in ways that are fair, because it makes absolutely no sense from a fairness point of view to give parking free of charge. It is not fair to all the people in the city, because people give up on road space, people give up on other things in order to create roads, and if people park on streets without paying for it, then there is a mismanagement or misallocation of national resources. So similarly, fair pricing of water, fair pricing of electricity, advertisements, much of the real estate which exists in the city, which is owned by governments. What is the reason to have a single-storied government office when you can have a multi-storied government office and earn the rental income from the other stories, right? So by renting out government buildings in a fair and market-friendly way. Many of the government offices, government buildings are rented out in extremely low costs. There are buildings in Bangalore where entire floors are being rented out at 250 rupees for the whole floor per month, whereas the per square foot rate in those places would be 5 to 10,000 rupees per square foot in terms of rental, right? So we are in a huge misallocation scene. And the last form of how cities can raise funds is through municipal bonds. The latest issue of Pragati, which you'll find online, has an article by Professor Mukul Asher on what do streets need, what do municipalities need to do in order to get their public finances right and tap onto the bond markets. So municipal bond markets, so where municipal governments can actually borrow money in order to do this. But of course, to be credit worthy, governments have to fix their balance sheets, their budgetary processes, give the credibility to the markets that they are credit worthy, after which they can get into the bond market. But this is where it helps democracy, because if you have to convince the bond market that you're credit worthy, you are most likely to be able to convince the citizens that your balances are in order. So in that way, getting into the bond market has a democratic advantage, in the sense that the bond markets and the educated people who are lending money to the governments will do the hard work which the citizens cannot do and don't have the capacity to do. Srinivas.
Yeah, thanks, Nitin. I was going to say that you talked about free parking and all of that, and a lot of us wonder. There's a lot of government state-owned assets are encroached upon, including lakes and government land. So it seems to an extreme thing to ask for people to park, because that's a national asset. So that'll be really a tough sell for people to get to that concept. Samredi wants to talk about petrol prices. Samredi?
Yeah, JP Garu, why the petrol tax in India is more as compared to the Pakistan? We can see Pakistan has only 32 rupees, in India 78 to 80 rupees always.
I don't know the details of Pakistan price structuring, but I must be somewhat unpopular and then be truthful. Our petrol prices are not too high compared with Europe, which is more sensible. And the taxation on petrol is not too high. Again, it's a great myth. There is cross-subsidization rather than taxation on petrol. There's actually a flat rate of taxation without going into too many details, and it's not too high. If anything, if you want to A, encourage exploration, or B, encourage alternative fuels, or C, reduce consumption of a particular fuel on which we are hugely dependent on imports, then I think the price should be an important signal. Therefore, that is not the real problem. The real problem is the unwarranted subsidies in certain sectors leading to either diversion, as in case of kerosene, etc., and leakages and corruption. And excessive cross-subsidization that is distorting both consumption patterns and leading to a mafia-driven black economy. So I'm not a populist who would say, bring down petrol prices. I think the answer lies in public transport being made viable and sensible and useful, and reducing the pollution as well as the consumption of these fuels. But without going too much into those things, a couple of points, Srinivas, if you permit me, on what Nitin made, very, very vital points. And also the earlier question, I forget the name. One way of ensuring accountability is not nihilistic or anarchic practices, as Nitin so rightly said, and Loksatta passionately believes in this, that we are responsible citizens and we are part of governance process. We are actually the establishment, not somebody else. And this pre-independence notion of attacking the government and bringing down everything is a silly way. That's not what citizenship does. But if we suppose promote stakeholder empowerment, let's say school district boards or some other stakeholder users and stakeholders directly controlling their destiny, you are now integrating the management of a resource or a service with the tax-paying capacity. It's not possible everywhere, but wherever you can clearly delineate or define the group of stakeholders, if you transfer the authority to manage the services and if it functions well, they benefit. If it fails, then they lose. That kind of accountability structure is there so that incentives are right. I think that's the right direction to move forward so that there is a greater alignment between taxes and services rather than doing something very populistic but extremely dangerous, the typically Indian way of being nihilistic. The second thing is we have to raise more revenues in local governments. There's no question about it. But I also want to urge caution. The world over, local governments simply do not raise resources to meet their requirements. Take the United States. 6% is the revenue raised as a share of GDP. 10% is the expenditure at the local government level. Take Britain. 2% is the revenue raised. 10% is the expenditure at the local level. Urban India increasingly can raise more revenues. In fact, I would say today cities are the wealthiest part of India. One of the quiet revolutions of India is because property values are appreciating. Despite all the incompetence in the system, the tax realization is improving in cities. The cities are now rich, relatively, even compared to state governments, etc. But the villages are poor because of a variety of reasons we all understand. We have done some study in Hyderabad, inadvertently because this Andhra Telangana issue, and the figures, while they are not surprising, are still revealing. Hyderabad city, if you take all the revenues raised by the state government and the revenues transferred from Delhi and take it pro rata on the base of population, the city's annual revenues, I'm talking of minus local taxes, I'm talking of the other state and union revenues attributable to Hyderabad and transferred to the state, is 20,000 crores per annum. The money spent by the state on Hyderabad city is 7,000 crores, all put together, including salaries of people who are serving Hyderabad city, including policemen, including teachers, etc., etc., etc. Even if you assume that the centralized larger services like dams and big highways which the state spends, which are not merely in the Hyderabad city, it probably doesn't exceed 10,000 crores. So another 10,000 crores is surplus generated only in Hyderabad city for the government of now Telangana, earlier Andhra Pradesh. I'm sure the same picture prevails in Bangalore or Mumbai or Chennai because we haven't really done this study. We can easily undertake this study and demystify these whole numbers. And this money is going to other areas. Now, I have no quarrel. Certainly, Bangalore must subsidize the rest of Karnataka. But if Bangalore's needs are not really taken care of, you're killing the golden goose. Maybe this is one way. By revealing these numbers and making Bangalore citizens stand up, Hyderabad citizens stand up and say, where is our drainage, where is stormwater drainage, where is our sewerage, where is our road system and transport network, etc. Why the hell are we not really getting the things that we deserve with the money that we have? Yes, put some money back to the other parts of the state, but first take care of the needs of the city, if nothing else because you want to generate more revenues from the city. I think that pressure has not been so far put because we really didn't know the numbers so far. Even I was not aware until Hyderabad became a major issue in this Andhra Telangana problem. And I wanted to sensitize everybody to that. And third and last thing from my side is, as I said, cities are getting richer. Could we use this as a mechanism to actually empower the cities, at least to start with? When we were all fighting for local government and third tier of democracy, we all talked about villages. While villages are still important, because city taxpayers see themselves as taxpayers, maybe that is where the real impulse and the pressure to devolve powers and resources and to manage resources locally and to make them accountable will come. And I think if from this discussion at least some clarity emerges collectively among us, how to take this forward, how to build some kind of pressure mechanism in cities to devolve resources and to ensure that there is greater alignment between taxes and services, that will be perhaps productive. Srinivas.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mahesh.
Yeah. JB, this is from a user question. This is from Magesh from Kuntur. His question is, why can't be the taxes more of direct rather than indirect taxes? Doesn't such type of indirect tax create imbalance in the society? Isn't it possible to spend the tax money in the same sector from where it is generated? In fact, from a survey from Center for Civil Society, listed that approximately 10% of money spent from poor goes as indirect taxes.
Before you answer that, so let me just give a time check. So we have last 5 minutes here, and we have a couple more questions, Dr. JP and Nathan. Just 5 more minutes.
Okay, I'll be very brief, Srinivas. The first question is, I'm sorry, I lost track. Very briefly, Srinivas.
Why can't be taxes more of direct tax?
Direct, indirect. Okay. Yes, ideally we must move towards more and more direct taxes, but there is a limit to that all over the world. In fact, what Margaret Thatcher tried, the poll tax, was perhaps the ultimate form of direct tax. And you have seen the political consequences even in a country like Britain. A great leader was disgraced and ultimately thrown out of power because of a hugely unpopular direct tax. Direct taxes world over, after a point, are hugely unpopular. Two, indirect taxes are still necessary for two reasons. To painlessly collect taxes in the largest possible ways, as Nathan rightly pointed out, you can't afford only 40 million people paying taxes. You have to have a larger number paying taxes. Therefore, the easiest way to spread the net wide is indirect taxes. But equally important, to specifically direct consumption on the basis of public policy. If you want to discourage certain consumption or encourage certain other consumption, indirect tax and therefore the price signals on account of indirect taxation is one important mechanism. Therefore, it's not something terrible. But in general, countries, as they become more and more prosperous and more democratic, they move from indirect taxes to direct taxes. The poorer the country is, the lower the direct taxation base, the lower tax GDP ratio, and the greater the indirect taxation. And India actually is moving from indirect to direct taxes. If we take the federal government level, in the states there is hardly any direct tax, therefore it doesn't really work. But at the federal government level, the indirect taxes are slowly giving way to direct taxes. Earlier it was entirely indirect taxes, 25, 30 years ago, very little direct taxes. Whereas today, direct taxes are almost equal to indirect taxes at the Government of India level, and it's going to get better over a period. That's the good news. And if you actually include service tax also as a direct tax, which is a bit in between, gray area, probably direct taxes already exceed the indirect taxes in the country. That's the right direction. The second part, we already answered in part. There is no way we can collect taxes as a cess for every service and then put back money in the service alone. To some extent, we can do that, but we can't do it fully. Market cess, for instance, can go back to only markets. There is no way education, which actually should get the lion's share of government expenditure in a civilized country, can raise money only as education cess 100% and then utilize only for that. Therefore, while some money will go in the form of a cess, a significant money will be collected as a tax, and it will go back to sectors where the priorities that the people approve. That's what a mandate and election is about. See, you and I don't decide priorities because you and I are not elected. The elected government has a right and a duty to assign priorities. And they keep changing from time to time depending on the public perception as well as the experience of the recent times. And therefore, you ultimately have to have general taxation kitty and prioritization. There'll be some cesses where the money goes to certain sectors only allocated. But let's not be overly enthusiastic. But one word of caution, Nitin mentioned this, and somebody asked the question, can we give up the current form of taxation? I know Baba Ramdev's advocacy. I know of Adda Kranti movement. And I want to be a little more candid than Nitin. Nitin has been very diplomatic and being a nice guy. I want to be a harsh guy. You know, in medicine we have a dictum: an uncommon diagnosis is uncommonly right. World over, if a certain pattern of taxation has worked, there is almost no country which is a serious exception to certain pattern of taxation. Let us not reinvent the wheel. Taxation is much too serious a business. Government revenues are much too serious a business. If you think you can now invent something spectacular and make it work, it will be a disaster. Even countries which went through major revolutions, real revolutions, never change the fundamental tax base. It's a disastrous thing. Many of these numbers are outrageous and wrong, and there is no substitute to improving the taxation and improving the link between taxes and services and improving the system of accountability and making the expenditure possible as close to the citizens as possible. There are no shortcuts. Let's not think of some harebrained revolutionary idea where current tax structure is completely dismantled. Something dramatic and new will emerge and we will change India. There are no shortcuts, there are no quick fixes of that kind. Srinivas.
Nitin?
Yeah, I just want to add, it's very little I can add to it, but you know, generally in terms of public finance optimization, it is considered a good idea to have all the taps flowing into one bucket. So all sorts of taxes going into one bucket, and then the aggregated bucket will then move the funds into wherever necessary. So in other words, having earmarked taxes, whether it's a cess for education and or a special surcharge for public transportation, then an oil surcharge, it's generally considered as a bad idea. So you should take all the money from various taxes, put it into a consolidated fund, and then reallocate it according to priorities. So the priority would be education, healthcare, basic services of the state. So as an I mean, we can prove that mathematically, as many of us do. But as an optimization problem, earmarking is a very bad idea. So we should not try to, we should not try to get into the fashion of cesses and earmarking of various reasons, because that's a very wonderful way to make hide the fact that the government has been wrongly allocating resources or misallocating resources, because it's like you spend all your money and then they say, oh, now I need some money for education. You know, so generally that's the simple story which works out. So let's not get into earmarking.
Hi, Nitin and Dr. JP. I have the last question for you. Can we talk about the mother of all taxes? We've talked about how to generate more taxes. We've talked about how localities can do interesting, simple things to increase the amount of inflow. This mother of all taxes is known to impact the market economics. It's necessary to balance our fiscal deficit. It's known that it will increase our GDP. And yet, is there no political will to implement it, or is there good reason not to implement the GST?
Now, what is this mother of taxes? Internet
The GST.
GST.
Oh,
GST. I might just want to jump in here and let Dr. JP have the last word. You know, GST is just this wonderful political football. It's a great idea. It's a necessary idea. It falls into exactly some of the things we were discussing: broad basing the tax base, moving to consumption taxes, where you can make exceptions for such that you know, poor people don't have to pay higher taxes for basic necessities. So all these factors have been debated, thought through, and the formula has been arrived at. Unfortunately, we were in a political situation in the last 4 or 5 years which prevented us from moving forward on this. So there is absolutely no good reason to not to do this. We should have a GST as quickly as possible. It makes excellent public finance sense, and I just hope that our politics will fall in place to make it happen in the next couple of years.
I agree with Nitin Srinivas and Tara. I believe in the next year or so we should get GST in place. I'm optimistic. There are 2 impediments so far as I understand, but Nitin is an expert in the subject. I'm not. The first is much of GST collection will now be by the federal government. In effect, what we're saying is the states' indirect taxes, sales tax, etc., will also be collected by a single agency, both the federal and the state central excise as well as state indirect taxes. And the states are loath to lose power because power is where money is, power is where patronage is, power is where transfers and postings are. All the corruption emanates from this. The second is there's a genuine apprehension that certain states may actually lose revenues when they switch over to a different system. But earlier we dealt with that reasonably well in case of VAT. Many states are worried, but experience proved that actually state revenues have improved, not declined. And in a few rare cases where revenues have indeed declined, federal government can easily make good those resources. But one impediment I see is from the states of Maharashtra and Gujarat. Unless octroi is abolished in the city areas, Ahmedabad, Mumbai, etc., that has become the very big source of revenue for the local governments, particularly municipal governments of these two states, and B, that's become a phenomenal source of corruption and patronage. And these two are very powerful states. Now, unless we also deal with that, because they become the economic hub of India, I really don't know how we're going to manage the tax structure. And somehow, I don't hear much about octroi being abolished in these two states. And I think we must make some noise about it. But otherwise, I entirely agree with Nitin. But I believe it will happen in the next year or two. VAT is a good example of what happened. This too will first states will not stop it. In any case, there may not be many Congress governed states in India left anyway.
On that note, thank you, Dr. JP and Nitin for an exciting and very, very educative conversation. We all learned something out of both of you, and there is so much more to do. I would also take this opportunity to inform all the viewers and people that have asked questions to take the time to sign up for the interest group that Loksatta has. Vamsi, if you can flash that screen for the viewers, it's bit.ly/LSP Public Finance Forum. So please go to that URL and sign up so we can continue the discussion offline and have future events specifically on this topic and formulate our opinion on various subjects and things like that. The URL will also be posted on social media in short duration right after this. With that, thank you, Nitin, and thank you, Dr. JP, for taking your valuable time to talking to all of us. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. I think it's been a great discussion. And Nitin, thank you for joining us. I think it's very useful, very productive. I hope we'll take these things forward. Good luck and good night, good morning, wherever you are.
Nitin, you wanted to say something? Okay. Thanks.